All views expressed on the Vecinos podcast by the guest are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent, and does not represent the opinions of any entity or the opinions of any of S&P Global, the companies affiliated, or within the Vecinos Collective. Vecinos brings together a vibrant and diverse community of Latinx employee resource groups committed to fostering an environment of inclusion, visibility, and professional development through collaboration, networking, and mentoring for its members and the Latinx community at large. Today's discussion is about the importance of the 2020 US Census. We have an amazing group of panelists with us today, so let's get into it.
Hi, welcome everybody to our first of a series of podcasts with Vecinos. Today's topic is the 2020 U.S. Census, and we have two great panelists that will be driving the discussion around the census today and why it's so important. My name is Cristina Gonzalez, and I am the Director of Operations and Security Awareness at InfoSec for S&P Global. In addition, I'm also the Global President for Adelante, which is our employee resource group that supports our Latino family at work. I have been the global president starting this year in 2020, but I have been involved with them since I started working for the company. As we all know, the census deadline for submission is shortly coming in September 30th, and it's important for our Latino community in the U.S. to make sure that they're counted today and for the next 10 years. With no further delay, I will go ahead and introduce our great panelists. We have with us today Jeff Baylor, who is the director for the Census Bureau's New York regional office, and also Mark Hugo Lopez, who is the director of Global Migration and Demography at the Pew Research Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and ask Jeff to introduce himself, and then Mark go second, and then we'll start with the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here today. This is just such an important conversation, and it's an honor to be here with Mr. Lopez. My first opportunity to speak with him, and I know a lot about him, and I'm excited to hear his thoughts on the 2020 census. So this will be my third census. First in the New York region, I had the opportunity to conduct the census in 2000 out of the Detroit, Michigan region. In Census 2010, I was actually down in the Dallas, Texas region, and learned a lot, especially along the colonias and working with communities throughout Texas. And then I was fortunate enough to land here in New York, probably the most challenging region we have across the country, but it's also the most rewarding without a doubt. And I look forward to this conversation because we need to ensure we get the most complete and accurate count in this 2020 census.
Thank you. Mark?
I'm Mark Lopez. I'm the Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. I've been studying Latinos in the United States for a number of years now, and this is the second census that I've done some survey work looking at participation and in the census, or at least intent to participate. At the center, we've done a lot of work also looking at how Latinos see their identity. And of course, the work that we do using public opinion surveys and demographic data analysis depends a lot on what is learned from the decennial censuses. That plays a key role in our methodological work. It plays a key role in making sure that our surveys are representative of the US public. And so how the public participates and what we learn will be important for the next 10 years for our work at the Pew Research Center.
Thank you very much and welcome. So let me go with our first question, and this one is for you, Jeff. So you have a pretty impressive career with the Census Bureau. You've been there for over 23 years, if I read your bio correctly. So I'm pretty sure you're pretty familiar with the history, how it has changed throughout the years. So can you go into a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize Article 1, Section 2 in the U.S. Constitution mandates that we conduct an enumeration of the population every 10 years. And that first started in 1790. And the 1790 census was headed by Thomas Jefferson. A little over 3.9 million people were counted. And the largest geographic area by population at that time was New York, at a little over 33,000. And just look how things have changed over time. And there's been changes to content. When we look back, I think it was the 1980 census was the the first census in which the Hispanic origin question was added to the census. And I think that was only about 5% of the households nationwide received it. The following decade, all households, it became a normal question in our census activities. You know, in Census 2000 was the last census in which we had a long form, where 1 out of every 6 households are asked about the characteristics of their household and of their family and of their community. And we started the American Community Survey in 2005, which meant in 2010, that was the first short form only census. And of course, 2020 followed. So a lot of changes over time. And just in 2020, we changed the way we ask race and ethnicity. You know, that's not an easy question. And, you know, we have industry experts and community experts that work on this throughout the decade to really determine what's the best way and to get the responses we need to first show our representation and then to ensure that those communities receive their fair share of federal funding.
Right. So Marcus, to you, right? Because you're like a demography kind of expert, right? Number one is, and because this is the audience that we're targeting, why is it important for the Latinx community to fill out the census and get counted, especially in 2020?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons because the results of the census are used for a number of purposes. For example, congressional apportionment is important. In other words, how many congressional seats will each state have? Well, Latinos are concentrated in a few states. For example, Florida, Texas, California are states which have more than half of the nation's Hispanic population. Counting the number of people who live in those states, including the number of Latinos, will be important for congressional representation for those states in the coming decade. But there's more to it than just about congressional reapportionment. There's also the importance of knowing about how many Latinos there are in order to be able to understand what are the characteristics and what are the experiences they're having economically in later surveys that the Census Bureau might do. So for example, we'll want to know eventually how many Latinos are perhaps living in poverty because policy might be able to help address some of those issues. What about how many Hispanic school-age children there are in different places? That will be important for determining how many resources those schools receive as well. And of course, things like voting rights and so forth are also all part of the work that comes out of something like a decennial census. So a decennial census is important in so many ways in determining how many resources a community, in particularly Latino communities, might receive in the coming decade. So being counted is an important part of making sure that those resources that the area or the community needs are addressed.
Okay, perfect. So Jeff, going to you, one of the things that we constantly say, right, when we're trying to push the message, it's important that you get counted because it counts for 10 years, right? Why did the Bureau decided it has to be every 10 years, or why was that implemented with a 10-year count? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really our founding fathers. The U.S. Constitution determined that every 10 years, the years ending in 0 will be the time in which an enumeration of the population is done. And we've followed that ever since that first census in 1790. And I just want to add something that Mark mentioned about the importance. You know, when we talk about those funding programs and funding coming to communities, I mean, these are critical programs. You know, when we talk about, you know, things like Medicare or Medicaid, food stamps, TANF, WIC, when we look at the infrastructure of our communities, whether it's improving our roads, our bridges, our tunnels, you know, adding bus lines to our transit systems or train lines, you know, the census provides that information for planners, but also for the funding programs that come in to support those. When we talk about our children's education, from national school lunch and breakfast programs, Title I grants for supplies, Head Start, Pell grants for college-bound students, again, all come from formulas that use census data. And lastly, you know, I can't think of a more important or timely example of how census data informs both decision-making and funding when we look at our healthcare system. And we've seen our communities and the strain on our healthcare systems as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. I can't think of an easier way to support your local healthcare professionals than to take the 5 to 10 minutes to fill out your 2020 census today, because money for your hospitals, for your emergency personnel, for ambulances and fire stations, all comes from formulas that use census data.
Thank you. So, Mark, to dive a little bit deeper, right? So we all know that there's it's a part of our community, right, has this uneasiness about letting people know who they are and where they live. There's a lot of fears. Can you go a little bit into why this shouldn't play into them filling out the census?
Yeah, so the information that's collected in the decennial census is something that's private and is not going to be used for other purposes. So it's important to note that what's collected, the information that's collected on the census form, is not going to be used to, for example, potentially deport somebody who might be in the country without authorizations, or immigrants who might be here and who are undocumented, for example. And interestingly, over the years, in fact, the two censuses that we've done surveys of the Latino community on at the Pew Research Center, we found that, interestingly, it is foreign-born Hispanics, immigrant Hispanics, who are more likely to know that the census is not going to be used in some way to find them or perhaps pursue them in some way, as compared to, say, US-born Hispanics, who are somewhat more suspicious of the purposes of the data collection that's being done. So we saw that again this year as well in our surveys, that it was actually immigrant Hispanics who were more likely to say they're going to participate, who are more likely to know that citizenship wasn't going to be a question on the census form this year. If you remember, there was a lot of discussion about that. So it's striking that over the last two censuses, we have seen immigrant Hispanics, the ones who are more eager to participate, more eager to provide information, not concerned about doing so, and see the purpose of the census as important for their communities, at least when compared to the US born. Not as big of a difference, it's not a huge difference, but it's notable that US-born English-speaking Hispanics are somewhat less likely to participate. So it is important to participate, but for some communities, there is some concern about how that information might be used, and that might be some of the reasons why people, whether Latino or not, might not participate in the census.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Jeff, we all know that we've had a lot of issues. I mean, issues, the pandemic, right? That kind of, in a way, it helped that the Bureau actually extended the deadline, right? But I'm pretty sure that you still had a lot of issues or problems because of it. Can you speak a little bit about it, and how did the Bureau actually shift shifted to actually support their campaign during this time?
Yeah, great question. And certainly the pandemic has affected the 2020 census. One of the great things about 2020 is that we had the ability to add two additional methods for households to fill out their census. They could go online at 2020census.gov, or they could call it in over one of our toll-free telephone numbers. Two new methods that weren't available back in 2010. So we started the census at the same time, mid-March, right around March 12th, we started our mail out. And we were supposed to start knocking on doors of every household that had yet to respond beginning May 13th. And when you look back at May, the month of May, it wasn't safe anywhere to go out there to knock on doors, not safe for our employees and certainly not safe for the public. So that's when the decision was made by our Census Bureau leadership to really shift our operational timeline, push it later into the future, so that when all our in-person operations, from knocking on doors to those households that don't respond, to providing opportunities at street fairs or events or food distribution sites for the public as they're waiting in line to talk to a census taker and actually fill out the census right then on a device provided by the Census Bureau with our internet, to make it easy for them, to counting the homeless and those that are serviced by homeless shelters or mobile food vans, soup kitchens. All of those activities got pushed later into the calendar year. So we actually started knocking on doors in August, and we're going to continue to do that until September 30th. It's important to note that there is a deadline right now, and it is September 30th for self-response, whether you go online, call it in over the phone, or if you still have that paper questionnaire, or you receive one, because we're doing a 7th mail out as a result of concerns raised by our partners and the importance of paper forms to a lot of communities, because that is the trusted way. That's the way they feel most comfortable about completing their census. So we've incorporated a 7th mail out with paper questionnaires going out to non-responding households. But September 30th is the deadline. We need to be sure everyone gets counted by that.
Cristina, I was going to say that one of our surveys that we've recently done asked the U.S. public about whether or not they've participated in the census already. This was done in June, and we found that about 3/4 of the U.S. adult population said that, yeah, they had participated. 14% said no, they hadn't, and the remainder were not sure whether or not somebody may have filled out the form and included them in the count already for their household. It's an interesting set of numbers because that's June, so that's several months after March. Of course, we're in the moment of a pandemic, but it is interesting that some Americans haven't quite filled out their forms. We followed up with another question. We asked whether or not people would be willing to answer the door if a census taker came and knocked on the door. And we found that among those who haven't filled out their form or weren't sure yet whether or not it's been done, 40% said that no, they wouldn't be willing to answer the door. So this is an interesting challenge. I think it's a challenge often with any decennial census, and perhaps it's amplified in some way this year because of COVID-19 and so forth. But there are some Americans who may not want to answer the door when a census taker comes. But this is how you finish the census. This is one of the most important ways to get folks to participate in the census is this knocking on doors. But that was one of the findings we had from mid-June. Things may have changed by now, and more people may have participated as well, but that was what we found then.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So Jeff, with that, right? How would you make sure that you ensure for those Americans that feel that opening the door to a census taker is not safe? How would you say that? How would you dispel that disbelief, this improper belief?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Let's first focus on safety from a perspective of health. All census takers must wear a mask. When they knock on the door, they need to back up 6 feet. This is part of their training. There's no need for a census taker to go into someone's home to collect that information. And we remind them about washing their hands. We provide hand sanitizer to all our census takers. We tell them not to go out. If they're not feeling right, if they're feeling ill, they shouldn't be out there knocking on doors. And as a result of some of these procedures and guidelines we put in place, most recently, the Center for Disease Control, in conjunction with the Census Bureau, issued a joint statement letting the public know that opening your door to a census taker is low risk because we've incorporated some of these strategies to ensure the safety of the health of the public. The other key thing is the safety of the data that we're collecting. And our census takers, what they look like, first off, as I mentioned, they'll be wearing a face mask. But they'll also have a badge, a photo ID with an expiration date, as well as a U.S. Department of Commerce watermark. They'll be carrying a bag, and they'll be collecting the information on a smartphone. So you'll see them holding a smartphone. The data that they're collecting, and Mark mentioned this earlier, we don't ask citizenship status on the 2020 census. That's important to note because at the time we start knocking on doors, that's typically over the past decades during a census when you'll see scams start. And it's important to know what we ask and what we don't ask. So let me first start with what we ask. Name, phone number, age and date of birth, race and ethnicity, whether or not you're of Hispanic origin, your tenure, whether you own or rent your home, your sex, and then your relationship to the first person you list in your household, mother, father, son, daughter. That's all we're asking. We don't ask for citizenship status. We don't ask for bank account or credit card information. We never ask for money, and we never ask for Social Security. So that's important to know. In addition, every census taker, everyone who works at the Census Bureau, whether it's 4 weeks or whether it's 4 decades, we take an oath of confidentiality. And that oath states that if we were to release information that it would identify an individual or a household, we'll be imprisoned up to 5 years and fined up to $250,000. Title 13, as Mark mentioned earlier, is the law that's in place that protects every piece of data that we collect. And under this law, we cannot report, we cannot release information. No local, state, or federal law enforcement agency can ever access our data. That means no local housing authorities, no IRS, no Homeland Security, no ICE. And we've even been taken to federal court numerous times over the past 7 decades, and the Census Bureau has won every time. Title 13 became in existence in 1954, and it has never been breached. So it's important to know that it's safe to talk to a census taker. The last thing I'll mention regarding census takers, if we knock on your door and you don't answer or you're not there, we leave a little slip on your door. And that little slip says, hey, we stopped by, we'll be back in a few days. Or if you want, go online today. Here's the web address, here's your census ID, and here's a telephone number. And we have seen response rates tick up in the areas in which we began knocking on doors because we certainly understand people don't want to open up their doors. They're worried. Still another great reminder that you can go online at 2020census.gov or call one of our toll-free telephone numbers.
Thank you, Jeff. As an information security professional, I cannot tell you how important it is that the information is out there for people to know what kind of information you guys require and ask for and which ones you don't, right? Because there's always going to be fraudsters out there trying to steal people's information. All right, so Mark, any other things that you want to share about sort of if the growth of the Latinx community in the U.S. and how is expected to develop?
Well, the Census Bureau this summer published its latest population estimates, and this is from 2019. And it estimates that the size of the nation's Latino population is at almost 61 million people. That's up from about 50.5 million, which is what was counted in the 2010 census. And so the population has grown over the course of the last decade. In fact, what's interesting is that about half of the nation's population growth has come from Latino population growth. So Latinos are a key, an important part of U.S. population growth overall. It's actually been a key part of the story since at least 2000, if not earlier, that Latinos have played an important role in Hispanic and U.S. population growth overall. So when we talk about the U.S. Latino population, it's likely that the 2020 census will show at least 61 million Latinos counted. It may even be more. It may depend on how many people respond. And also, it's possible that some trends that have emerged over the last decade may have been things that necessarily weren't first captured or weren't part of the 2010 results that we're seeing. And it's possible that there may be more Latinos in the U.S. than the population estimates show. That remains to be seen. We'll see what happens. But as a side note, in 2010, the 2010 census counted about 1 million more Hispanics than the 2009 population estimates had said were in the country. So it is interesting that sometimes our population estimates may be a little bit different from what you might find in an actual count. That's another reason why these counts are so important, because we could use estimates, and estimates are great, but actual counts are very important for knowing how many people are in the country. And again, as I said earlier, it's important for researchers like us. We use that data to calibrate our surveys. We use that data in many other ways to provide information to the public.
So Jeff, back to you, right? And I was just thinking as he was talking, right? And I know you've mentioned a few times that actually reverting the Title 13 law that protects the anonymity of the census data is very difficult. Can you just once again reassure the population that it's not as simple as going into federal court and just getting it annulled and giving other law enforcement groups access to it?
Yeah, absolutely. Title 13 basically states that the data that the Census Bureau collects can never be used against an individual or a household for harm. And if you see our data when we release it, it's at a statistical summary at some level of geography, whether it's at the state or congressional district or county or city or town, or even down to a census tract level. That's typically the lowest level that will provide data for, because we cannot release data that could potentially identify an individual or their household. And again, every census employee who whether you work for a 4-week operation or you work at our headquarters, you take that oath of confidentiality. Very few people have access to the 2020 census data. Only those people who need to create the files that we're turning over to Congress or to the states for their redistricting. This data is protected, and we know that the public's trust is the foundation of getting a complete and accurate census. And that's why we put all these procedures and oaths in place to ensure the public understands and they can trust us that when they open that door, when they fill out that form, they know the data will not be used against them for harm.
Thank you. Right. So just to round it out and wrap it up, anything that you want to leave our audience with? I mean, besides go to census2020.gov and fill out your census or call the number. So actually, Jeff, can you share with our audience the phone number they can actually call to fill in the census?
Yeah, so we have 13 different toll-free telephone numbers, one for each language that we support. So for English, it's 844-330-2020. And for Spanish, it's 844-468-2020. And I'll just mention in closing, a very simplistic example I like to use to explain to our partners in our communities what a census really means to your future, to the next 10 years for your community. Imagine you have a school of 100 kids in your community. And let's say in the 2020 census, only 80 of those kids get counted. For the next 10 years, that school is going to get 80% of the funding it deserves. And it doesn't just affect those 20 kids who weren't counted. it affects all 100. And that's why it's so important we get a complete and accurate count. You know, taking 5 minutes to go online or to call it in over the phone is an investment in your community for the next 10 years. So for all of you who filled it out, we're over 80, I think over 82% nationally now when you look at those who filled it out, self-responding, plus those who've been enumerated by us knocking on the door. Thank you so much for filling it out, for having that conversation, for giving us your data. But your job's not done. We need you to talk to your family, your friends, those you worship with, those you work with. Tell them how easy it was for you to fill it out or to have that conversation at the door. Let them know what you learned today about the data protections that are in place, security protections, and let them know what's at stake for the next 10 years.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Mark?
So the census is something that the results from the 2020 census is something that I'm looking forward to see how the story of the nation's Latino population has changed over the course of the last 10 years. And a lot of the results that come out of this census are going to really shape what we know about the Latino population in the coming decade. And I know everybody loves to know about particularly, you know, where are people from? What are their origins? Those are the sorts of things that we're going to learn from the 2020 census and get some really important updates, including the geography of the nation's Hispanic population. Where do Latinos live? They've been dispersing across the country, and while California, Texas, and Florida, and New York may be the biggest populations, some of those stories about places like North Dakota and South Dakota and the South are going to be really interesting to see how they've changed over the course of the last 10 years. So as a researcher, I'm looking forward to it. So I hope folks fill out the census form so that we can tell and continue to tell those very important and rich stories about the nation's Hispanic population.
So thank you both. It was a very interesting discussion and very eye-opening for me. I thought I knew a lot about the census, but I did not. Thank you. And to our audience, thank you for listening.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. We want to thank our panelists, Jeff Baylor and Marco Hugo Lopez, and a special thanks to our moderator, Cristina Gonzalez, for this incredible discussion. And a big thank you to all our listeners.